by investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, which came out in the late 90s. And it's about this thick, and if one wants chapter and verse of the improprieties, infidelities of the president on the personal side, as well as mistakes that Hersh believes that he made, particularly in foreign policy, be my guest, knock yourself out, read it from cover to cover, and you will see that side, the dark side of Camelot. I don't know if Mrs. Kennedy was taking into mind a week after the assassination how history would view her husband's policies, foreign or domestic. But most people think she knew, at least to some extent, of his infidelities, and there's indication that she did. And so I think she was trying to get ahead of that by creating this Camelot mythology and legend, if you will. So what I do is, since I'm focusing more on the images that she's creating, I make the case that, again, symbols are not always true. They tap into ideas people want to believe in as true. And people wanted to believe in Camelot. They want to believe in this shining golden age that was the Kennedy administration. And that she, therefore, succeeded in getting out in front of both stories that would come out about her husband's personal life, as well as revisionist history that would come out and will continue to come out. But I would also say that in this 50th year that we are commemorating the Kennedy administration and calling it Camelot, so we still use that metaphor that she created, I hear, of course, people give both sides of the administration, the good things that they did and the mistakes that they made, and about President Kennedy's own personal foibles and peccadillos. But I think by and large, people still have an interest in his presidency and in her, and you all are testament to that, to come out today. Yes?
What do you know or think about the movie that is due out this week called The Kennedys? It was thrown out by the History Channel because the Kennedys objected to it, but it's still going to be...
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. There is a movie that will be out this coming week. I believe it starts about the 3rd or so of April, first week in April in any event. It will not be on the History Channel because the History Channel is committed to telling the truth and to being as factual as possible. And there were some questions about the validity of some of the portrayals of the Kennedys and these very foibles, peccadillos, especially those, the personal side. Because the dark side of Camelot, even if only half of it's true, is pretty bad. But one must ask, could all of these negative things be true? And what happened with the movie was Ted Sorensen, President Kennedy's famous speechwriter, with whom I met, I should say, to do an interview about Mrs. Rose Kennedy. I met with him back in June, and sadly he passed away this past October. Ted Sorensen, when I said, you want to know what the title of my Rose Kennedy book was, and I said, Rose, Mother of the Kennedy Image, and he shook his head and he looked a little negative and he said, I don't like that word image. Because to him, he was trying to portray the substance of the Kennedy administration, both when he worked for Senator Kennedy, President Kennedy, and all the years after. So he never wanted people to think that there was no substance in the style or the image. So I understood why he took issue with that.
Oh, taking off now, isn't it?
He also was leading the charge against this upcoming movie because he believed it was filled with inaccuracies. And so I guess it's like anything that's in the media, whether it's a television show, a movie made for television, books, be they of scholarship or journalistic quality, it's all up to us to decide, based on our own reading and our own understanding of the record, how much is true as being portrayed. But what we should say is, this is not a golden portrayal of the Kennedy administration. In other words, it contains negatives as well as... if I can find it on my new digital service from Comcast, I was just saying, I came up with my friends Rose and Rob Capon, and I said, oh, you know, that movie's coming up when we were talking about it, and I said, I'm pretty sure I saw the channel when I first got my upgrade several weeks ago, but it seems to have disappeared, so I'll probably be on the phone.
Look at it pick up now.
To say I'm a scholar
I believe
of the
Kennedys,
and so I will watch it in case I get questions like this out on the stump, where people will say, have you viewed it and what did you think? I'm sensing that
somebody suggests, they said that these two boxes, that one of them was a PC and it was a fan blowing the curtain. There's no fan in either one of those things. It's a VCR and a satellite box for cable.
And then second, the personal side. I would just say that if we disqualify
this curtain hadn't moved in about a month
who had an extramarital affair, we're going to be down to a low number of men, anyway, who qualify for the White House. I think there was another question, was there back here? Yes.
I just wanted to throw in a few more words about Eleanor Roosevelt.
I will say, I know you'll have that chance next week. If you want to compare her to Mrs. Kennedy, let's do.
Commenting on your statement about children in the White House, for the first 2 years of the Roosevelt administration, she had 2 grandchildren in the White House.
She had many grandchildren, and there are wonderful photos of her and FDR in the White House surrounded by, I would say, at least a dozen of them. And I should also say to you that I had the pleasure this past December of dining in Bistro Bis up here in the Hotel George. And I was with a colleague, and I said, "Do you see that gentleman who came in?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "You know, that looks like one of Franklin Roosevelt's grandchildren." And my friend quite understandably said, "How would you know what one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandchildren looked like?" And I said, "I've seen this one on C-SPAN. I saw him on C-SPAN 2 years ago." So my colleague was too embarrassed to go up to this man. I, of course, showing no embarrassment or shame, go up to this man who's having dinner, turns out with his daughter, and I say, "Are you Franklin Roosevelt's grandson?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "How did you know me?" And I said, "Oh, I saw you on C-SPAN 2 years ago." He was on the Democratic committee that was trying to determine whether Mrs. Clinton or Barack Obama would get which of the delegates as they got towards and closer to the Democratic convention.
Now it's almost stopped.
They're around, and we can.
They're talking about Roosevelt and Obama. Let's see if they get talking about Kennedys again, if it picks back
in the
up.
White House, which is wonderful, and I'm sure the American people love seeing it. It's not quite the same as the first couple having young children. There's just something that is beguiling about that, especially if there are 2 young beguiling children, as there are now in the White House and as there were in the Kennedy years. And you also may have heard the stories that because Mrs. Kennedy was so concerned about privacy, her own and her children, that she would draw lines about when the children and how the children could be photographed. But famously, when she would leave the White House, as she often did, alone, to go out to Northern Virginia or to go abroad without the president or without her children sometimes, President Kennedy would go to Pierre Salinger, his press secretary, and say, "Pierre, it's time to get pictures of the children." And so some of those most wonderfully compelling photographs that we have of President Kennedy in the Oval Office, and clapping and the children dancing around him on the carpet, those were often taken when Mrs. Kennedy was away. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about her understanding of her image and how that would play out during the Onassis marriage?
Absolutely. A little bit about how Mrs. Kennedy's image played out once she remarried. And she married, of course, Aristotle Onassis in fall of 1968. Remember the timing of that for her and for our country. Her brother-in-law Bobby, to whom she had grown so close in those intervening 5 years from when her own husband died, and Bobby, who had become a surrogate father to Caroline and John, was himself struck down by an assassin in June of 1968. And Mrs. Kennedy supposedly commented, our country is just going crazy, and if they're killing Kennedys, my children might be next. So she was obviously looking for safety and security, which Aristotle Onassis represented by having his own island, all right, off the coast of Greece, to which he could take her and the children, not to mention his own yacht, and not to mention millions and millions of dollars. Because even though we think of the Kennedys as being wealthy, and Mrs. Kennedy had been left fairly well off by her husband's will, it was not necessarily enough to support her in the way she had grown accustomed.